Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming. This is my favorite place, maybe on the land. This is the second barn that we ever took down from Mahwah, New Jersey. And it was given to us, and it's an unusual barn. It's kind of like the subject I was just thinking sitting there that we're going to talk about today. It was built by French Huguenots about 1760, and it was the LaRue family, which LaRue, a lot of them streamed into northern New Jersey and New York because they had already fled from France, being persecuted, into Holland. And from Holland had come to even England and then over to what was at that time the English colony of New York. Really even before the Dutch, it had turned over in 1664 to the English. But anyway, it was the LaRue family, and it was a barn that was moved. Probably a third of the barns of the hundreds we've worked on were moved. At some time, they were unpegged, taken up the road. They were taken up the road whole. They were taken up the road in pieces. They were reparted out, but they were used over. They were recycled and reused and repurposed, like we do with them. And it had been down the road about a half a mile and was moved probably about 1870, but it was built in 1760, I think. And it was at a house where Washington had stayed. So he was in this barn. Here he's going to walk in the door any moment. I always say that Washington's horse slept here. So I've got notes, but really just bullet points, and I'm going to, and toward the end of this, I'm really going to divert to something different. So if you want to walk out beforehand, you're going to miss something. But I want to talk about communities like the Huguenots. I recently met a man. We just blew in from New York up around Albany in the mountains, and I made a mistake of driving on Monday morning. I woke up at midnight Monday morning. We were going to leave Monday morning about 5. And I woke up at midnight. I said, I'll never fall back to sleep. Let's go. And we drove from 1 a.m. from 100 miles north of New York City to Memphis on Monday. I don't know. I said after that, 2 days later, I said to my wife, I said, remind me not to do this again, please. Kind of, at my age, took it out of me. I used to be able to do that kind of stuff. Can't do that anymore. Anyway, then the next day we cruised from Memphis across the Mississippi and into Waco. But here we are. Anyway, I met a man in New York, and very interesting. He had told me he belongs to an intentional Christian community in New York area and around the world, and he was telling me that when he was a young man, he read an article in the 70s on communities. And he said, I'm quite sure he said that there were 700 in this book listing of intentional communities in America at that time. Can you imagine 700 communities? You know, that was that time. It was the 60s, the 70s, and he picked out this one that he's part of today. He was drawn to it, and I thought about that. What's happened? And I think we'd be hard-pressed to find 70. What do you think? I don't think there are all that many left. He commented on how many are defunct from back then and don't exist anymore. And I want to talk about what did happen to them and really the history behind it. And then I want to talk about what does it take, perhaps, maybe from my point of view, of what does it take to make it work? Because it's got to work. It has to. I mean, if Jesus' prayer that we would be one, even as he and the Father are one, where does this leave communities? You know, when we said in the description, we said sustainable communities. And by that, I'm really speaking, we could talk practically a long time. What makes a sustainable community? We could talk about the economics of it. We could talk about all those things. And but I really want to focus really on what really holds them together holistically. So it includes all that. It includes economy and society, relationships, mentally, spiritually, what holds, ultimately I want to talk about, I think holds a community together, or what will help them succeed, and what are the challenges. And, we live in the age of the radical individual for a while now. And there's a lot of contributing factors to that. So here we are, we're talking community in the Western age of radical individuals. I think of that army, I think it was the Army had a advertising, be the army of one. And we do. We live in an age of tremendous divisions. We live in an age where maybe even, not maybe, definitely, technology has a big thing to play in that, in which, there's more cell phones in the world than there are people. Imagine that. Who would have thought maybe 30 years ago that there would be such a thing as that, the internet, the whole thing, email, texting, the whole thing that's really led to a tremendous individualism. Something that was meant to be the communication, commune, one with, communication age has really led to probably a tremendous social division in our society. Dividing communities. Connectivity has made us very unconnected. Some people have described us as a nation of hermits. How's that? That's hard to imagine. But you look at other things like the basis of every community being families, and the basis of families being marriage, and the decline of marriage. What are we towards 60% divorce rate in America? So the basic fundamentals of community have been breaking down. And it gets to extremes. It's getting to extremes now. Even in places like, have you heard, what are they called in Japan? The hikikomori? They're people, young people. And Japan is quite an industrialized urban culture. The world is an urban place. In 2007, the world, for the first time in history, tipped the point where more people live in urban areas than live in rural areas in the history of the world. So we are an urban world now that people live in. So in Japan, this culture's arisen, and I see it in America. I see it in my extended natural family where, I have a nephew like this, or maybe even more than one. But they're young people who simply stay at home. They no longer go out. They live their entire lives online. All the relationships are online. They order everything in, thanks to Amazon, and I guess Amazon's in Japan. We certainly could do this in America, but they order everything in, and they no longer go anywhere outside their homes. They work online, and they do not go out, and they don't want to get involved in the sticky mess of human relations. And there's over 5 million of them in Japan. So that's about, 1 out of every 25 people, it's 125 million people, 1 out of every 5 people, or 1 out of every 3 people in Japan is living a life like that. And you think of those people doing that today. So my point being that the very nature of the church is it's called the body of Christ. This means it's made up of many parts, like a human body. We all know that. And the question is it possible to live a Christian, sustainable life without being part of a larger community, where the members live together by a covenant community? And I'm saying to that, I don't think it's possible. And that the very definition of what the church is involves community. What does community mean? With unity, one with. The very nature of it. Well, we can do that, alone. Collaboration has always been the key to communities. And long-term, enduring, sustainable culture has to have communities. So As we say a lot of times, the necessity for that is the possibility. And that's what we want to talk about, is the possibility, but I want to go into some history of that. Sometimes individual families find themselves alone and live alone, but ultimately it takes a community to work with. And I think the challenge is understanding what has made communities fail. So what's our history? Let's go back through some history about communities. Even going back to the Roman Empire at that time, the beginnings of the church, of course, it was synthesized with Constantine into the Roman Empire. But they say when the Roman Empire fell, what did the Visigoths sack Rome in the 400s? And people ran through the streets saying the world has ended. And it had. For them, for the empire, it had ended. But how did Western civilization survive? But none other than monastic communities, covenant communities, scattered throughout Europe, preserve Western civilization. And then the history of America is largely the history of covenanted communities. You know, many different groups. Of course, we always think of American history kind of Anglo-centric, but what's the oldest state capital in America?
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe, you're right. You got it. You grew up in New Mexico. In Mexico? New Mexico, he's right. It's Santa Fe 100 years before any Jamestown or St. Augustine is the oldest city in America, a Spanish city. So, of course, the conquistadors brought along with them Catholic friars, creating missions, communities. And then the English history, a whole century later, really, Jamestown, 1607. So a whole century later, English started coming over. And we'll go into, there were some of them were founded purely economically, but most were founded with a religious communal basis to them. How about the separatists who came? Of course, what were the separatists versus the Puritans? New Englanders, right? Who do we know the separatists as? The Pilgrims. That's a much later name. I think maybe Longfellow made that up, started calling them Pilgrims. They didn't call themselves Pilgrims at Plymouth. They called themselves separatists because they wanted to do what? They wanted to separate from the Church of England, a bunch of Englishmen. They wanted to separate in order to reform the church. They said that the Church of England was irreformable. You couldn't purify it, like the Puritans said. But we had to separate ourselves from it. And they were very persecuted at that time, and they fled to where? Holland. They fled to Holland, I think, for 11 years. And the separatists, and then ultimately their pastor was John Robinson, and they, in 1620, came to America, really aiming for Virginia, but some people say they really meant to get to Massachusetts, and that's where they wound up. And we know the history of the separatists at what was called the Plymouth Colony. So right then, you had the beginning of communities in America. Now, Jamestown was different, and other colonies in ways were different because they were often economically founded. Again, later came Quakers and all different groups fleeing persecution in Europe. The Puritan migration was called the Great Migration, with John Winthrop as their governor, into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which ultimately absorbed the separatists. Separatists were a very small group. I think only 60 of the 120 were really from Robinson's community. The others were people taken along for economic reasons who wanted to come to the New World on the Mayflower. And half of them died the first winter in December anyway. So only about 60 people survived right there, and that we're going to go back around to that. But again, the Huguenots, the Quakers weren't real welcome by their fellow Englishmen in New England, my mom's family. A Quaker come into Connecticut, you get one warning to leave. Second warning, you come back, cut your ear off. Next time you come back, draw and quarter you, cut you up. pieces. They weren't real welcome. Of course, Penn came in, 1692, 1690 maybe, and founded the City of Brotherly Love, which was what? Philadelphia. Are you from Philadelphia? No. You were homeschooled. No, I wasn't from Philadelphia. I was homeschooled. That's a very interesting answer right there. But sure, they came, nonviolent people. Penn was interesting, being nonviolent, he had a little problem because they were up against the Allegheny Mountains to move west and expand the colonies, but who happened to inhabit the Allegheny Mountains was the Iroquois. And the Iroquois were not nonviolent. And he then he sent his agent, James Logan, back to Europe and looked for groups of people to come and settle up against the mountains. Of course, he brought the Anabaptists from Germany. And remember, Germany was very allied with Britain. Matter of fact, King George I, I think he came to the throne in England in 1710 maybe. He was a German. I think he did not even speak English, and he inherited the throne, the British throne, in 1710, and came over from Germany and was the English king. And he invited his fellow Germans to come over, and they settled in his colony of New York and Pennsylvania. By that time, New York was Duke of York, the king's brother, and formed the colony of Pennsylvania. So all different people were coming. Some of them even were economic, You look at the Palatines, who came at the behest of George for the Royal Navy to make naval stores in the Hudson Valley. Palatine Germans came. So people could point out and say, well, there were a lot of people who came that were not religious communities, but they were very tied together religiously just the same. The Palatines came. They ultimately split up because they couldn't tap the pine trees well for naval stores. Pitch and tar. If you have a wooden naval ships, you need naval stores. You need varnish and turpentine and all these things. And they tried that, and it failed, and George said to them, go settle wherever you want. They went down into Pennsylvania with the Amish and Mennonites at the time, and then they went off up into New York State, and they're still there today. There was another group, the Scots-Irish. We'll come back around to them. We got a lot of Scots-Irish, I suspect, here. The McGinnises, and we'll talk about them for a very specific purpose a little later, other than to say that Penn brought them over too. He sent Logan back. He said, go back to Europe and get me someone who will fight for us. And he found the Scots-Irish. Are you surprised? I can say that. My mom's a Scot, not a Scots-Irish. He's a Scot. Anyway. And again, there were innumerable smaller later communities. How about Roger Williams? Breaking off from the Puritans, a Puritan minister in Salem, Massachusetts, going against the grain of the marriage of church and state, the imbalance of the Puritans, and breaking off from them, ultimately being maybe driven out by John Cotton, and walking and founding this place called Rhode Island. And we'll talk about him more in a little bit. So overall, and later, look, we're talking about the 17th century and into the 18th century. How about in the 19th century when the Whitmans went to Oregon on the Oregon Trail? A religious community. Communities banding together. Would any of that would the Oregon Trail have been possible without that? What did 50,000 people die along the Oregon Trail? We were on the Oregon Trail in Idaho one time, and I thought, the Oregon Trail, 50,000 people. How long is it? That meant a person was buried about every 100 feet on the trail. So through tremendous sacrifices, people came in communities. And what I'm saying is that it really wouldn't have been possible without people and the collaboration and the self-support that comes by communities. And it really dominated the successful settlement of North America. And again, there were some independent things, a lot of independent things going on. So, what really works against communities? And I understand that, it's a lot of people say it's just not possible. Where did those 700 communities go to from 50 years ago? And imagine we have a lot of people said, it's just not possible. And the paradigm of individuals being the church is what will work. A lot of folks in many areas of America or individual families kind of hold up on private homesteads trying to do it. How often do we meet people saying, homeschooling, we gave up. We just had to, we just couldn't do it. We were just alone, we couldn't. It felt impossible. Homesteading, the practicalities of homesteading, on how difficult they are to really undertake alone. I think in our community, what we couldn't do all the different things without all the different people doing those things. And it goes further than that, though. Really, Jesus said, with man it is impossible. What did he say that in response to? I believe a man came to him and said, can you heal my daughter? Or is it my son? He said, can you? The word can denotes the ability to. It's not may you. May is permission. Can I do this? Yeah, yes, you may. One's permission and one's ability. Yeah, I know you can do it, but you may do it. And that's a big lesson. It's an important lesson. Because the person said, can you heal him? And Jesus said, can I? Of course I can. He said, but with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. So what does it mean? How about John 2:25? He did not need anyone to testify concerning man and human nature. This is amplified. For he himself knew what was in man, in their hearts, in the core of their being. And that's indicating it wasn't good. As a matter of fact, it was impossible. And people point to that and say, it's just not possible. I tried it. I was part of a community. We tried this and we tried to come together and then this happened and this unraveled and that unraveled, and that's true. But what is the answer to that? I think of my own family. I think my ancestors in Rhode Island, they went with Roger Williams, the Arnold family. They were one of the 6 families who went with Roger Williams, fled to Rhode Island right after him. They joined him in Rhode Island, William Arnold. And they were part of that. I grew up in Catholic schools, taught by Jesuits. What happened? We knew nothing about those people, that we had come from them. So what happened? What has unraveled all the time, and it, we had a pretty quick unraveling in our family. We had William Arnold's son was a governor, a good guy, Benedict Arnold, the governor, whose great-grandson was Benedict Arnold, the general. We kind of came undone pretty quick. And then through wars, through terrible things happening, we really wound up as a family in a pretty dissipate place in New York City after the Civil War. And knew nothing about what we had been given or what we were part of. Membership in traditional mainline denominations, in the past 15, 20 years has absolutely plummeted. I mean, what are some of the statistics? Down 40%, down 30%. What's the statistic for young evangelicals who go to college? How many lose their faith? 72% lose their faith. What's happening? Much less to community. human nature. But it's got to be possible, like Jesus prayed, that we would be one. What could that mean except community? People say, are you a commune? No, we're not a community. No, a commune, we are a community. It's a difference. I read a book recently called The 11 Nations. And he talked just about this kind of thing. And he pointed out that this fellow said his contention was that there were 11 main groups in America that gave us our culture today. I just mentioned a bunch of them, including Native Americans and Northern Mexicans who have come into, really, like we said before, coming into New Mexico and Texas. He named these 11 different groups, Scots-Irish, New Yorkers. And the thing about it, he said that New Englanders, he said that the idea of settlers coming, he said as few as 200 people can create an entirely new culture. They're going to leave an indelible mark on where they settle, he said. Look at it. And then he proceeded to give all the examples. He said, take the Dutch in New York. Now, the Dutch were founded by not any religious community. Governor Stuyvesant said, coming to New York, there were about 300 people. He said, you can hear 18 languages at once. And he was right, they could. Because the Dutch, in that sense, were very tolerant, whereas their New England neighbors that they called Yankees were not. And the Dutch, of course, were founded very economically. The Dutch West India Company founded it. It was a money-making deal. The Huguenots came there religiously, and other groups did, but there was actually a tremendous religious freedom there because they simply did not want to, they were focused on economy. Is New York today still focused on economy? Right? How about New Englanders? How interesting that Portland, Maine, sea captains from Portland, Maine, founded what? Portland, Oregon. Isn't that interesting? How do they compare those two places? They're a lot the same, politically. And if anything, these things live down through the ages in politics, right? They've endured through politics. The church may be defunct. I travel New England looking for historic buildings. There's boarded up churches everywhere. They may be a jazzercise place now or something, or workout centers. That's a big thing in churches because they're like this. They're big open areas, but they're defunct. They're no more. And yet, that Puritan melding of church and state, not separating, not having a clear vision of separating church and state, has really lived down through the centuries in America, in those areas, in that one nation, in a sense. Now, he went on to say, this author in the 11 Nations, he said, really, America could break up into 11 nations sometime. Oh, come on. Then he said, well, do you think anyone in Soviet Russia in 1980 believed that within 10 or 15 years there'd be no more Soviet Union? I doubt it. How interesting. That was his contention. I'm not saying that, but that was his contention. But he said these areas, the Scots-Irish coming into Tennessee, across into East Texas, and really doing a lot in Texas to give it, it's in many ways, its political and social bent. That's where our heritage comes from. Politically, it lives on. What? Of 21 congressmen from how many? Are there 6 or 7 New England states? Or 21 congressmen from those states. There's not one Republican. And of the 12 senators, that means 6. There's got to be 6 states. of the 12 senators, there's one Republican senator. In other words, I'm contending that he's right, that culture's lived on. Having lived in New York and come from there, in New York, it is very economically oriented. In Texas, it's very oriented like the Scots-Irish in many places. So, what I'm saying is that community is a powerful thing. What it brings to a place and settles in a place will live on in that place. Even a few people have tremendous effect. So what happened? What about human nature? So many people saying that it's just not possible. It just can't be done. We tried it. It didn't work. And I want to go over now what I feel like could be a key to making communities work. And I'll say that communities are not for the faint of heart. Can anyone agree? They're not for the faint of heart or the thin-skinned. And what can make them work? I'll tell you what happened here. Ready for this? Last night I went home and read this. I really wrote it down. I dictated it to my wife on the way home from the east. We've been up there a while. And we wrote it out and we typed it out and I got it ready and I worked on it. And I got to this point of saying, what is the answer that can make communities succeed? And that we not retreat into individualism. Individual families trying to live out that vision alone, because it sure doesn't seem like that works either. And I got to the point, I said, well, listen, I'm going to read this thing through to you. And I said, I got to this point in this thing, because I'm coming to the conclusion here. And I said, oh, boy, I don't get it. It's not coming together. I mean, it's all the points are good, but it's not coming together. And I want to tell you something. Anyone believe in dreams? Anybody? Do you believe in dreams? Okay. I said, forget it. I'm going to go over it in the morning. Now, we're pushing that to the 11th hour this morning, right? So I went to bed and I had a dream last night. You ready? And in the dream, I was in Texas. And I was appointed the director of the State Historic Museum in Texas, like the one in Austin. I'm going to the one in Austin, big place, I love history. So, it's a good job. And I get this job, and here's where it gets a little odd, and they come to me and they said, we have a problem. We have the bones in boxes of a lot of famous Texans. He said, and we have lost the bones of Sam Houston. Okay. Well, of course, I woke up from that thinking, that is rather odd. Now, let me tell you something. Now, I haven't read biographies of Houston. I've heard some things about Houston. And I think, what we've done in our radical individualism is we've lost the bones. We have lost something that we've got to find. And in this dream, we sorted through boxes, and I said, no, we've lost it. And they reported to me that they said, we've lost his bones. And I thought, Lord, what did we lose? What have we lost? Who was Houston? He was a Scots-Irish, right? Born in Virginia, moved to Tennessee, the mountains of Tennessee. And the Scots-Irish, they were pretty downtrodden people. They're Scots-Irish because they're in Belfast or in Northern Ireland. They were gotten by King James when he conquered Ireland. What did he do? A very Anglo-Saxon strategic thing to do. But he removed a lot of Scots from Scotland and moved them to Northern Ireland, right? And he pitted one Celtic people, the Scots, against another Celtic people, the Irish Catholics. Two Celtic peoples, and they still do, right? So what did it breed? It bred a pretty tough people, right? Matter of fact, it bred a people that they said, Penn said, go get me a people. And he said to them, a disposable people that will fight. And about 110,000 Scots-Irish came over to America around 1710, for a decade. They came to America as what? Free men ready to build their log cabins? No, not at all. They came as indentured servants. That's how they got there. They had nothing. They came willing to work 7 years. Okay? And it's from that stock in the 1800s, 100 years later, 1793, that Houston was born. And his father moved them into Tennessee. And you know what he did? I think at the age of 36, he was elected governor of Tennessee. And he was the only man in American history to serve as governor of 2 states. If he's not the most colorful figure in American history, he's pretty far, he's right up there, right? But what I'm trying to say is that, you know, the Scots-Irish, this man in the 11 nations, he said, now the Scots-Irish, he said, if someone in the mountains moved within 5 miles of them, that was entirely too close. So they weren't exactly communal people, you know? They were fiercely independent people. And he was born to that kind of stock. And as governor of Tennessee, something went amiss as a young man. He was married, and his marriage failed. And he left Tennessee, he resigned the governorship, and he left Tennessee. And again, I don't have all the history of Houston at all, but I know he left Tennessee and he went to live with the Cherokee Indians. As a matter of fact, they accepted him into the tribe and made him a member of the tribe and a representative to the government when the Cherokee were forcefully moved west of the Mississippi. And he was in Oklahoma at that time, I think, when the Texas Revolution broke out. And he came down to Texas, and he headed up, after the Alamo fell, he headed up the Texas Army. And he was very disliked. He did things that the Scots-Irish and the settlers to Texas really, they were fighting mad about him. He would not take a stand and fight. Ever hear the runaway scrape? He did the runaway scrape. They ran away across Texas to the Houston area. And he kept retreating and retreating and retreating, and his men were, about to mutiny against him, and he held them together, and then finally he fought the Battle of San Jacinto. And it wasn't, let's eliminate the Hispanic Anglo conflict. Read about people like, what was his name, Lorenzo de Zavala, the Texian. And the thing I thought about Houston was that, he came from that fiercely independent stock, but there was something about him that would take a stand and say no. He had suffered through some things that were pretty terrible, like when he left as governor and resigned as governor. And they rebelled against him. Ultimately, he served as what? The first president of Texas. He served as governor of Texas 3 times. He was a U.S. senator from Texas. And he was back governor that 3rd time during what? The advent of the Civil War. When that happened, he was a Union man, and he was in Austin, and he just felt like the war would not, no matter what, it was going to turn out bad. And he didn't want Texas to get involved in it. What did they do? They drove him out of Austin. A mob apparently drove him out of Austin and took him out of the governorship. And he went back east, East Texas, and lived the war and died in 1863, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg. when news reached Texas. So what am I saying? I'm saying that what is there to that guy? It seems like he did things and stood up for things at a cost to him personally tremendously. And that in communities, he who separates himself seeks his own desires, or says seeks his own gain. And that's the very thing that we cannot do if we're going to have a successful community. I thought about this study called, ever hear the O-liner study? And they said that they went after World War II and they studied why did some people stand up against the Holocaust. Gentile people, I believe they studied, in Europe. And they found something common about all of them. I guess they did it in the 50s or 60s. And they found a common thread that ran through these people, that they were mostly all raised in communities of relational authority, in which they were instilled with a personal moral agency. Something was instilled in them that even if I have to go it alone, I am not going on with this. I'm going to stand up against this, even at the cost of my life. Personal moral agency. And that it only came from communities where these people came from. And that if we ever hope to produce personal moral responsibility, personal moral agency in communities, if we ever hope to have communities succeed, we're going to have to overcome human nature to do that. I remember the founder of our community, Brother Blair, saying often that if there's a failure, it's a failure of love. And I thought of the attributes of love. Seeks not its own gain, always hopes, always trusts, and never fails. Always trusts in community. That's tough. Always trusts, always hopes. Seeks not its own gain. I thought of 1 Corinthians 13. It does not envy, does not parade itself, is not proud, does not seek its own, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That what it's going to take in communities is love, ultimately. Greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends. And without that kind of overcoming, transcendent love, yes, with man it is impossible to do it. And I think of the ending of all, in that chapter, it says, keeps no record of wrong. If there's any lesson in the story of Joseph, it's keeping no record of wrong. His brothers come down to him. They had wanted to kill him. They just sold him into slavery in Egypt. And when they came to him again and he said, I'm your brother, fear came upon them that he would revenge them in the powerful position he was in, Joseph. And it's the lesson of Joseph that says, no, there has to be forgiveness. And how often we pray, forgive us as our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And what an essential part that is in community. Of course, it goes on and it says in the end that when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly. It says that we're looking through a glass darkly, I think King James says. What does that mean? What do you look at in a mirror? Yourself. What did the song that we sang last night say? I want to try to change the world. And it said, show me myself, I believe it said. So that's what it's saying. It's saying that we're looking in a mirror darkly. We really can't see ourselves alone. It's not real clear alone to see ourselves. When we separate ourselves, it's pretty hard to see yourself alone. But then we will see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I am also known. Or it says fully known. What does that say? I will know just as I am fully known. As we enter into a community and all those complex relationships of human nature, allowing ourselves to be known by other people, that's a very risky thing. It draws us out of our comfort zones that we all love to do that. But if we're willing to do that, I believe a community can succeed. If we're willing to be drawn out of our comfort zones into a place of vulnerability, vulnus, wounds, and if we'll keep no record of wrong, we'll succeed. And it's not going to come in any easy way in communities. It's not. But we live in an age where we've lost the bones. We've lost that thing in us, in people, and examples that of people who stood for things that at any cost, at a cost of their lives, they'd stand and they'd hang in there. How many people have abandoned communities because it just got to be too much? It was too much of a confrontation of problems and human nature and themselves. But if we're willing to hang in there, if we're willing to be fully known ourselves, it can succeed. Thank you. Love, the most powerful force in the world. What does it say? That if a man were to give everything he had for love, it would be utterly despised. It wouldn't be enough. That's how valuable it is. And that's the only thing that can ultimately hold a community together, is love. Thank you.